I thought the lake cabin was finally quiet. No noise, no neighbors, just peace. Then the door burst open. Karen from the HOA stormed inside like she owned the place, yelling about permits, violations, and unauthorized guests. She waved papers in my face and threatened fines, eviction, everything. She didn't even look at the man sitting at the table, calm, well-dressed, listening quietly. Karen kept shouting, getting louder, more confident by the second, but she made one fatal mistake. The man she was screaming at, the man she told to stay out of this, was the state attorney general, and the meeting she just interrupted was about corruption. The lake cabin was supposed to be quiet. That was the whole point of coming here. No ringing phones, no neighbors, no interruptions. Just water gently tapping against the dock, tall trees standing still in the morning fog, and one important meeting that needed privacy more than anything else. The kind of meeting you don't hold in an office, the kind you hold far away from curious eyes. I was in the small kitchen pouring coffee when I heard footsteps on the porch. That alone was strange. No one was supposed to be here. Before I could even turn around, the front door exploded inward, slamming against the wall so hard the old wood groaned in protest. Cold air rushed inside, carrying with it the sharp sound of boots and an angry voice already mid-sentence. "I knew IT," she shouted. "I absolutely knew this place was being misused." Karen from the HOA stormed into the cabin like she was leading a raid. Her clipboard was clutched to her chest, papers sticking out at every angle, her face red with excitement and rage. She didn't knock. She didn't ask permission. She didn't hesitate for even a second. She walked straight in as if the cabin belonged to her. She immediately started shouting about unauthorized use, guest violations, and emergency HOA inspections. Her voice echoed off the wooden walls, bouncing through the cabin like gunfire. It was loud, invasive, and completely unhinged. "This is exactly why HOAs exist," she yelled. "People like you think you can just do whatever you want." I stood there frozen for half a second, coffee mug still in my hand. Then I set it down slowly. "Karen," I said calmly, "you need to leave. Right now." She ignored me completely. She marched further inside, pointing at furniture, at the windows, at the dining table, muttering violations under her breath like she was reading off a criminal record. She talked about parking, permits, noise complaints that didn't exist, and fines that grew larger with every sentence. She still hadn't noticed the man sitting at the table. He was dressed simply. No suit jacket, no tie, just a calm presence, hands folded, posture relaxed. He looked like someone who had nothing to prove and no need to rush. The kind of person who listens more than he speaks. Karen finally turned toward him. "And you," she snapped, jabbing her finger in his direction, "don't even think about interfering. This does not concern you." The room went quiet, not the awkward kind of quiet, the heavy kind. The man slowly lifted his eyes to meet hers. There was no anger in his face, no shock, just calm curiosity, like someone observing a situation that had already answered itself. Karen mistook that calm for weakness. "Oh, don't look at me like that," she continued. "I don't care who you are. If you're here illegally, you'll be fined just like him, maybe worse." I stepped between them slightly. "Karen, you are trespassing." She laughed, actually laughed. "Trespassing?" She said, "This cabin is under HOA jurisdiction. I can enter any time I believe there's a violation. And believe me, there are violations." She waved her papers inches from my face. Numbers, clauses, red highlights. None of it meant anything, but she believed it did. Belief was her fuel. Fear was her weapon. The man at the table finally spoke, softly, calmly. "Ma'am," he said, "who authorized you to enter this property?" Karen scoffed. "I don't need authorization. I am the authorization." He tilted his head slightly. "Is that so?" Something about his tone made my stomach tighten. Not fear, anticipation. Karen puffed up, clearly enjoying the attention now. "I run this community. I decide what's allowed and what isn't. And this meeting?" She glanced around the room. "This meeting is over." The man reached into his jacket pocket. Karen's mouth kept moving, but her words slowed as she watched him place something flat on the table between them. A badge, plain, official, undeniable. She leaned forward instinctively to read it, and that's when her face changed. The color drained from her skin so fast it was almost shocking. Her confident posture collapsed into something smaller, tighter. Her grip on the clipboard loosened. The badge read, "State Attorney General." The silence that followed was absolute. Karen took a step back. Then another. I didn't know," she stammered. There must be some mistake." The Attorney General stood slowly, every movement controlled. "There is a mistake," he said evenly, "but it isn't mine." He looked at her, not with anger, but with disappointment. "You entered private property without permission," he continued. "You interrupted a confidential meeting. And you attempted to assert authority you do not have. Karen's clipboard slipped from her hands and hit the floor with a hollow crack. The lake outside was still calm, the cabin silent. And Karen finally understood. She hadn't walked into a violation. She had walked into the law. And this was only the beginning. For a few seconds after the badge hit the table, Karen didn't move at all. She stood there stiffly, as if her body was waiting for her mind to catch up. The confidence that had carried her through the front door cracked, but it didn't disappear completely. Karen had lived too long believing volume could replace authority, and habits like that don't die easily. She cleared her throat and straightened her jacket, tugging it down with sharp, jerky movements. Then she lifted her chin and planted her feet wider apart, like someone bracing for a fight. To anyone watching closely, it was obvious she was terrified. But Karen had never been good at backing down. Fear, to her, was just another challenge to shout over. "Well," she said loudly, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle and thin, "that doesn't change anything." I blinked. The Attorney General didn't. Karen tapped her clipboard against her palm, regaining rhythm in her voice. "This cabin is still under HOA jurisdiction. Titles don't cancel violations. Everyone answers to community rules." She spoke faster now, piling words on top of each other, as if speed could rebuild the authority she felt slipping away. She demanded names. She demanded identification. She demanded to know why an unauthorized guest was present and what business was being conducted inside an HOA-controlled property. The Attorney General remained seated. That alone seemed to confuse her. Most people stood when Karen barked orders. Most people apologized, explained themselves, or rushed to comply. She had built her entire sense of power around that reaction. But the man across from her didn't even shift in his chair. His hands stayed folded on the table. His expression didn't change. That calm unsettled her more than anger ever could. She mistook it for hesitation. "You're awfully quiet," she said sharply. "That usually means someone knows they're in the wrong." He raised his eyes to her again, slow and measured. "Or it means they're listening." Karen scoffed. "I don't need you to listen. I need compliance." She turned back to me, waving her clipboard. "You never submitted a request for a private meeting. You never notified the HOA of overnight guests. And I highly doubt this man is on the approved visitor list." "There is no visitor list," I said. "There is now," she snapped. The Attorney General finally spoke again, his voice still even, still calm. "Ma'am, do you understand the difference between community guidelines and state law?" Karen rolled her eyes dramatically. "I understand power, and I understand responsibility. Something you two clearly don't." She paced the length of the cabin, heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor. She pointed at the windows, accusing us of hiding things. She gestured toward the door, threatening to bring in law enforcement if we didn't cooperate immediately. Each sentence grew more aggressive, more desperate, as if she could feel control slipping through her fingers. "You don't get to decide what happens here," she said. "I do. That's what people elected me to do." The Attorney General tilted his head slightly. "Did they elect you to enter private property without consent?" Karen stopped pacing. "They elected me to protect the community," she shot back. "That includes inspections." "Inspections require notice," he replied. "Not an emergency," she said quickly. "And what was the emergency?" he asked. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything that could justify her behavior. "Suspicious activity," she finally said. The Attorney General nodded once. "And what, specifical?" "Why, suspicious?" Silence. Karen's fingers tightened around the clipboard until her knuckles turned white. She hadn't expected questions. She was used to accusations ending conversations, not starting them. "I don't have to explain myself to you," she snapped. "You're not above the HOA." That was the moment I realized she truly believed it. Not just as an act, not just for intimidation. She believed the HOA sat above everything, above privacy, above the law, above reason. The Attorney General leaned back slightly in his chair. "People with real authority," he said quietly, "don't need to raise their voices." Karen bristled. "Don't lecture me." "I'm not lecturing," he replied. "I'm observing." That sentence hit her harder than any insult could have. Her face flushed and her breathing grew uneven. "I don't care who you are," she shouted. "This meeting is over. You will leave this cabin immediately, or I will call the police." For the first time, the Attorney General smiled, not warmly, not cruelly, just slightly. "That," he said, "would be an excellent idea." Karen froze. What?" she stammered. "Please," he continued calmly, "call them." Her confidence faltered again. She hesitated, phone halfway out of her purse. For a brief moment, doubt flickered across her face. But pride won out, as it always did. "Fine," she said. I will. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and dialed, pacing as she waited for the call to connect. She launched into a loud explanation about trespassing, noncompliance, and unauthorized gatherings, embellishing details as she went. The Attorney General watched her with quiet interest. When she hung up, she crossed her arms triumphantly. They're on their way. Good, he said. Karen stared at him, unsettled. You're very calm for someone about to be removed. He met her gaze steadily. I'm calm because I know how this ends. That confid. Ents finally shook her. For the first time since she burst through the door, Karen didn't have a response ready. The room felt smaller now, tighter. The lake outside remained peaceful, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. Karen had come in shouting, convinced fear would carry her through. She hadn't. Realized she was shouting at someone who didn't need to raise his voice at all. And when the police arrived, she was about to learn just how badly she had misjudged the situation. The man finally spoke, not loudly, not angrily, just clearly. Ma'am, he said, his voice steady and calm. Do you usually enter private property without permission? The question landed softly, but it hit harder than any shout ever could. Karen scoffed immediately, like she'd been insulted. She crossed her arms and let out a sharp laugh, the kind she used when she wanted people to feel small. HOA rules give me that right, she snapped. I don't need permission when there are violations. That's literally my job. She started pacing again, her confidence returning in short bursts. She talked about how many homeowners she had fined, how many she had put in their place, how many times she had stopped people from thinking they were above the community. Her words came fast, stacked on top of each other, like she was building a wall out of noise. I've dealt with people like you before, she continued. They all think the rules don't apply to them, and they all learn the hard way. The man didn't interrupt her. He didn't argue. He didn't even change his posture. He simply listened, eyes following her movements with quiet focus. When she finally stopped talking, expecting a reaction, he nodded slowly. And do you always interrupt confidential meetings? He asked. The room went still. Karen froze for just a fraction of a second. It was barely noticeable, but it was there. A crack, a pause. She didn't plan. Then her defenses snapped back into place. Confidential? She repeated sharply. There's nothing confidential in my community. If it happens here, I have the right to know about it. She stepped closer to the table, leaning forward, her voice rising again. HOAs exist to prevent exactly this kind of secret behavior. You don't get to hide behind fancy words. The man watched her for another moment. Then, without saying anything else, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Karen kept talking, not even noticing it first. He complained about transparency, about accountability, about how people needed to respect her position. But her voice slowed when she saw what he was doing. He withdrew his hand and calmly placed something flat on the table between them. It made a soft sound when it touched the wood. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. Karen leaned in without thinking, her eyes drawn to it like gravity. Her mouth opened slightly as she read the words stamped into the metal. The color drained from her face so fast it was almost frightening. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The badge read, State Attorney General. For a moment, the cabin felt completely empty of air. Karen straightened abruptly, as if she had been burned. Her clipboard slipped from her fingers and hit the floor, papers sliding across the wood. Her breathing turned shallow. Her eyes darted between the badge and the man's face as if she were hoping one of them would change. I didn't know, she stammered. I mean, you didn't say, there has to be some mistake. The Attorney General looked at her evenly. There isn't. Karen took a step backward, then another, until her back nearly touched the wall. The confidence she had marched in with was gone now, replaced by confusion and panic. She tried to gather herself, tugging at her jacket, smoothing her hair with. Shaking hands. I was just doing my job, she said weakly. I didn't mean to interrupt anything important. He stood slowly, his chair scraping softly against the floor. The sound made Karen flinch. Your job, he said calmly, does not include trespassing. It does not include harassment. And it certainly does not include interfering with a confidential state-level meeting. Her eyes widened. State? Meeting? Yes, he replied. State. Karen swallowed hard. But this is just a cabin, a lake house. You thought wrong, he said gently. This meeting was held here specifically because it required privacy. The weight of that settled on her shoulders. She looked around the room now, seeing it differently. The closed curtains, the phones placed face down, the calm way the man had listened to her rant without reacting, all the signs she had ignored. I didn't know, she repeated, quieter now. He met her gaze. Not knowing the law does not excuse breaking it. Karen's knees wobbled slightly. She reached out to steady herself against the table but stopped when she realized the badge was still there. She pulled her hand back like it was dangerous to touch. What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Attorney General picked up the badge and slipped it back into his jacket. "Now," he said, "we document what just happened." Her head snapped up. "Document?" "Yes," he continued. "Your unauthorized entry, your threats, your interference, all of it." Karen shook her head rapidly. "Please, this can be handled internally. I'll apologize. I'll leave. I won't bother you again." He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "People who abuse small amounts of power," he said quietly, "rarely stop on their own." Karen felt the truth of that statement like a physical blow. Outside, the lake was still calm. Sunlight glinted off the water. Brr. DS moved through the trees like nothing had changed, but inside the cabin everything had. Karen hadn't just crossed a line. She had walked straight over it, convinced she was untouchable. And now, standing in front of the state attorney general, she was finally realizing what real authority looked like, and it didn't need to shout. The badge wasn't flashy. It didn't shine. It didn't need to. It lay flat on the wooden table between them, quiet and unassuming, yet heavier than anything Karen had ever carried in her life. The words stamped into the metal were simple, direct, and impossible to misunderstand. State Attorney General. Karen stared at it as if it might suddenly disappear. Her eyes flicked up to the man's face, then back down to the badge, then up again. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. It was as if her voice had abandoned her completely. She took a step back, then another. It looked like the air had been punched out of her lungs. Her shoulders slumped, her posture collapsed. The clipboard slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a hollow crack, papers sliding across the cabin like scattered leaves. The woman who had burst through the door minutes earlier, loud and commanding, now looked small and unsteady. I didn't know," she stammered, her words tumbling over each other. "You didn't say who you were. I mean, if I had known." The Attorney General stood. He didn't rush. He didn't loom. He simply rose to his feet with the calm assurance of someone who had ended arguments his entire career without raising his voice. The chair scraped softly against the floor, and that small sound made Karen flinch. "Not knowing who I am," he said evenly, "does not change what you did." Karen shook her head rapidly, panic spreading across her face. "I was just doing my job. That's all. I enforce rules. I keep order. I didn't mean to interrupt anything important." He looked at her steadily. "You didn't interrupt something important," he corrected. "You interfered with it." The word landed hard. He took one slow step toward the table, placing his hand near where the badge had been moments before. "You entered private property without permission. You made threats. You attempted to assert authority you do not have. And you disrupted a confidential meeting protected under state law." Karen's breathing became shallow. "Confidential meeting?" "Yes," he replied. "Confidential." Her eyes darted around the cabin again, noticing details she had ignored earlier. The closed blinds, the phone set aside, the calm, controlled atmosphere she had shattered without a second thought. She swallowed hard. "But this is just a lake cabin." "That," he said calmly, "is exactly why it was chosen." The realization hit her all at once. Her knees visibly shook, and she reached out to steady herself against the edge of the table. She no longer looked angry. She looked terrified. "This meeting," the Attorney General continued, "was part of an ongoing investigation into HOA corruption across the state." Karen's head snapped up. "What? Abuse of authority," he said. "Illegal fines, harassment, threats, unauthorized enforcement actions, patterns of behavior that hurt ordinary homeowners." Each word seemed to drain more color from her face. "And just now," he added, "you demonstrated exactly why that investigation exists." Karen's lips trembled. "I'm not corrupt. I'm strict. There's a difference." "There is," he agreed, "and you crossed it." She took another step back, her heel catching slightly on the edge of a rug. For the first time, she looked like she might actually fall. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "What does this mean?" "For me, it means," he said gently, "that what you just did will be documented. Fully, accurately." She shook her head. "Pull. Ease. This can be handled internally. I'll apologize. I'll leave. I won't come back." He studied her for a long moment before answering. "People who abuse small amounts of power," he said quietly, "almost never stop because someone asks them to." Karen felt the truth of that statement like a weight pressing down on her chest. She had always believed she was untouchable, that the HOA shielded her, that her rules protected her, that fear made her powerful. Now she stood in a cabin by a quiet lake, facing the one title in the room that mattered. She wasn't in control anymore. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said weakly. "Intent," the Attorney General replied, "does not erase impact." He reached for his phone, not hurried, not dramatic, just precise. Karen watched his every movement, her eyes wide. "I'm going to request state investigators come here," he said. "They'll want your identification, they'll want HOA records, and they'll want a full account of your actions today." Karen's shoulders sagged. Am I in trouble?" He met her gaze calmly. "That depends on what the evidence shows." Silence filled the cabin again. Outside, the lake remained calm. Sunlight danced across the water. A bird landed briefly on the railing of the porch, then flew away. Nature was indifferent to the collapse happening inside. Karen looked around one last time, as if hoping the cabin might offer her an escape. It didn't. The argument was over. The shouting was done. The clipboard meant nothing. One title had ended everything she thought she was, and the consequences were just beginning. The sound of tires crunching on gravel drifted through the open cabin windows long before anyone spoke. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it carried weight. Karen heard it too. Her head snapped toward the door, eyes wide, breath caught halfway in her chest, the confidence she had tried so hard to rebuild a few minutes earlier finally gave up completely. Within minutes, unmarked state vehicles lined the narrow road by the lake. No sirens, no flashing lights, just calm, deliberate arrivals, people who didn't need noise to announce authority. Doors opened, footsteps followed, the kind of footsteps that didn't rush, didn't hesitate, and didn't need permission. 2 investigators entered the cabin quietly. They didn't look angry. They didn't look impressed. They looked prepared. Karen straightened instinctively, tugging at her jacket again as if posture alone might save her. She forced a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "There's been a misunderstanding," she said quickly. "I'm sure we can clear this up." No one responded. One of the investigators nodded respectfully to the Attorney General, who returned the gesture with a slight incline of his head. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The room shifted again, not with tension this time, but with certainty. Decisions were no longer being debated. They were being executed. "Ma'am," one investigator said calmly, turning to Karen, "we'll need to see your identification." Karen blinked. "My ID?" "Yes," he replied. "Please." She fumbled through her purse, hands shaking as she dug past makeup receipts and papers. Her movements were frantic now, stripped of the sharp confidence she once wielded so easily. When she finally handed over her driver's license, the investigator accepted it without comment. "We'll also need HOA records," the second investigator added. "Violation notices, fine schedules, correspondence, complaints." Karen swallowed. Those are at the HOA office." "That's fine," the investigator said. "We'll collect them." She nodded too quickly. "Good. Yes. You'll see everything was done properly." The Attorney General didn't interrupt. He simply watched. They began asking questions. How often did she conduct inspections without notice? How were fines calculated? Who approved enforcement actions? Were homeowners given appeal options? Karen answered at first with rehearsed confidence, repeating phrases she'd used for years. Community standards, board authority, good intentions. But the questions didn't stop. They kept coming, steady, precise, and impossible to dodge. Her answers began to falter. She contradicted herself. She forgot dates. She mixed up rules. One investigator quietly slid a folder onto the table. Inside were printed emails, complaint forms, screenshots, all neatly labeled. Karen stared at them, recognition dawning on her face. "These," the investigator said calmly, "are homeowner complaints filed with the state over the last 2 years." Her breath hitched. Threats she barely remembered making. Fines she thought no one would challenge. Letters she assumed scared people into silence. All of it had been saved. All of it had been reported. Karen's shoulders slumped. "People exaggerate," she whispered. "They don't like rules." The investigator met her eyes evenly. "Patterns don't exaggerate." The room grew quiet again. Outside, the lake shimmered peacefully. Sunlight danced across the water like nothing in the world had changed. Inside the cabin, "We're done here," one investigator finally said. Karen looked up sharply. "Done?" "Yes," he replied, "for now." She exhaled in relief too quickly. "Ma'am," he continued, "you'll need to come with us." Her face drained of color. "Come with you?" "I haven't been arrested." "No," he agreed, "but you are being formally questioned, and we need you present while records are secured." She opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. There was no point. The tone in his voice wasn't threatening. It was final. Karen gathered her purse with shaking hands. She looked around the cabin one last time, as if expecting someone to stop this from happening. No one did. As she walked toward the door, she tried once more to regain control. "I was just trying to keep order," she said softly. "Someone has to." The Attorney General finally spoke again. "Order without law," he said evenly, "is just control." Karen paused at the doorway. For a brief moment she looked small, older, tired. Then she stepped outside. There was no shouting, no clipboard, no threats, just quiet footsteps down the porch steps. Neighbors across the lake watched from a distance, unaware of exactly what was happening but sensing something important was unfolding. Karen was guided into one of the vehicles without resistance. The door closed gently behind her. The engine started. The vehicles pulled away. Inside the cabin, the silence returned. But it was different now, lighter, cleaner. The kind of silence that follows truth, not fear. The Attorney General turned to me and nodded once. "Thank you for staying calm." I nodded back. Outside, the lake remained still. Karen's power was gone. Her voice had no echo anymore. And the law, real law, had finally arrived. By the time the sun began to sink toward the water, the lake had returned to its natural stillness. The ripples smoothed out, the breeze softened, and the air carried that familiar calm smell of wood, water, and evening light. It felt almost impossible to believe that only hours earlier, the same cabin had been filled with shouting, threats, and the collapse of someone who thought she was untouchable. The Attorney General stood on the porch for a moment, looking out across the lake. His shoulders finally relaxed. The tension that had quietly surrounded the meeting all day seemed to lift, carried away by the fading sunlight. "I'm sorry this happened," he said quietly. "This was supposed to be a private, peaceful conversation." I shook my head. "You didn't do anything wrong." He gave a small nod. "People like her depend on fear. They don't rely on the law. They rely on the belief that no one will challenge them." That sentence lingered in the air long after he said it. He left shortly after, his vehicle disappearing, down the narrow road that curved away from the lake. Once the sound of tires faded, the cabin felt empty again, but not in a bad way. It felt clean, reset, like a storm had passed and left the world quieter than before. I locked the door behind him and stood there for a moment, hand resting on the handle. The wood felt solid beneath my palm, familiar, safe. That night, I sat on the porch alone and watched the sun disappear behind the trees. The lake reflected deep shades of orange and gold, undisturbed by boats or noise. A bird skimmed the surface of the water and vanished into the reeds. Everything felt exactly the way it was supposed to feel. Peaceful. Over the next few days, the consequences of Karen's actions rippled outward, far beyond that cabin. Word spread quickly through the community and then through others like it. The HOA board held an emergency meeting within 48 hours. Without Karen's voice dominating the room, the meeting was quiet, almost awkward. They voted unanimously to remove her from her position. Her access to accounts, records, and communication systems was revoked immediately. But that was only the beginning. State investigators expanded their work. They reviewed years of HOA records, fines, and complaints. Homeowners who had once been too afraid to speak finally came forward. Some brought folders of documents. Others brought handwritten notes. Many brought stories they had kept quiet for years. Fines were reversed. Threats were documented. Rules that never should have existed were erased. What Karen had built on intimidation unraveled piece by piece. A week later, the HOA itself was dissolved. A new temporary management group was appointed, one that answered directly to state oversight until everything could be rebuilt properly. For the first time in years, homeowners felt like they could breathe. I returned to the lake cabin a few days after everything settled. The door still closed smoothly, the lock still worked perfectly, nothing had changed physically, but everything had changed emotionally. I made coffee in the same kitchen where Karen had stormed in. I sat at the same table where the badge had been placed, but now the space felt different, lighter, as if the cabin itself had exhaled. I locked the door again when I left, not because I was afraid of Karen. She had no power anymore. I locked it because peace is something you protect. Not with fear, not with threats, but with boundaries. The lake didn't need rules to stay calm. It didn't need someone shouting orders or waving papers. It stayed peaceful because no one tried to control it. That was the lesson Karen never understood. Authority doesn't come from noise. Power doesn't come from intimidation. And control without law always collapses. Karen learned it the hard way. She thought she was walking into a violation. She thought she was asserting dominance. She thought she could scare people into obedience. Instead, She walked into a cabin where the law was already sitting quietly at the table, and when real authority finally stood up, she had nowhere left to hide. The lake returned to silence, the cabin returned to peace, and the fear she relied on disappeared for good, because some doors should never be broken into, especially when the law is already inside.